evening and welcome to the Alan Martin Lecture. My name is Carolyn Strange, and in my capacity as head of the School of History at ANU, I would like to welcome you to the 20th Annual Alan Martin Lecture, delivered by Professor Glenda Sluga. This lecture and associated events this week are supported by an endowment provided by Beryl Rawson, Martin's widow, in commemoration of his career and contributions to the study of history within the Research School of Social Sciences. When Alan Martin enrolled as a PhD student at ANU, the first to earn his PhD here in 1955, the campus had more lawns and fields and far fewer buildings. Martin walked, as we do today, on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, to whose elders, past, present, and emerging members of those groups, I pay my respects, as well as to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander persons in attendance. Alan Martin began his teaching career at the University of New South Wales, then at Melbourne University and the University of Adelaide. In 1966, he became the Foundation Chair of History at La Trobe University, where he remained until his return to ANU in 1973. Appointed a senior fellow, Martin remained in that position until 1992. ANU was astute to select their first graduate. Over his tenure at La Trobe, history blossomed into a world-class department, largely due to Martin's commitment to cross-fertilize the discipline through the insights and methods of political science, law, and sociology. The latter discipline was the specialty of his first wife, sociologist Jean Martin. Martin's own scholarship deepened understandings of the nation's political history, and it advanced the craft of biography in Australia. With co-author Peter Loveday, his 1996 monograph, Parliament, Factions and Parties, the First 30 Years of Responsible Government in New South Wales, 1856 to 1889, he set a high benchmark for the interpretation of colonial politics. The emergence of the Australian party system, a major collection Martin co-edited in 1977 with Loveday and Eric Fry, was the first substantial account of its subject, and it remains pertinent today. Martin subsequently published two landmark biographies of Henry Parkes in 1980 and of Robert Menzies, 2 volumes in 1993 and 1999. At ANU, Professor Martin was widely renowned for his warmth and generosity toward colleagues. His mentorship of higher degree research students at ANU, whom he often hosted at his home, was legendary. His co-host was Professor Beryl Rawson, whom he married after the death of his first wife in 1983. An eminent social historian of classical Rome, Rawson was a prominent figure in the humanities at ANU and a leader of the disciplines of classics and history in Australia. After Alan Martin died in 2002 at the age of 76, Professor Rawson was committed to commemorating her late husband's legacy. The bequest she established in his name has allowed the School of History to bring an impressive array of prominent Australians and overseas historians to ANU, starting with Professor Inge Glendenin. Our former speakers also include Rhys Isaac, Marilyn Lake, Tony Ballantyne, Annette Gordon-Reed, David Armitage, Anne Curthoys, and most recently, Sheila Fitzpatrick. All of them have honored Alan Martin's memory by delivering a public lecture, providing workshops for HDR students, and meeting one-on-one with them, as well as engaging with members of the Canberra public. Through these forms of engagement over Alan Martin Week, nominees enliven the study of history at ANU and model the qualities Martin epitomized as a scholar. We are delighted that this year's Alan Martin lecturer is an historian who exemplifies that same spirit of intellectual curiosity and generosity. Glenda Sluga is Professor of International History and Capitalism at the European University Institute in Italy. She currently holds a European Research Council Advanced Grant, which commenced in 2020. This 5-year research program concerns 20th century international economic thinking and the complex history of globalization. However, her expertise in this field stretches further back in history. For instance, her 2021 book, The Invention of International Order, Remaking Europe After Napoleon, was published by Princeton University Press. Professor Sluga is also a professor of international history at Sydney University, where she was awarded an Australian Research Council Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellowship in 2013. In that 5-year project on the subject of inventing the international, she mentored numerous students and helped to launch their careers. This evening, Professor Sluga brings her international expertise home to address the topic of Australians as international economic thinkers. But you don't want to hear any more from me, you want to hear from Professor Sluga. So with that in mind, could you please silence your phones and join me in welcoming Professor Sluga.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by acknowledging the First Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I want to thank also the Alan Martin family. I actually, when I first, the first thing I ever worked on, my master's thesis, I was very influenced by Jean Martin, actually, and I didn't know so much about Alan Martin. But it's very nice to be able to kind of come back into that context again. And of course, to the history department here, which is full of so many wonderful historians and colleagues, and so many of you whose work has influenced some of what I'm going to talk about tonight, and who I admire so much. So thank you very much for being here. I'm just going to put my timer on to make sure we don't go too long. Okay, so originally I was going to be talking a few years ago, and then COVID interrupted. And in that time, I started working on international economic thinkers as part of a larger project. And when I was asked to come and give this talk, I thought, as I often do when I'm here, that it's interesting and important to be able to incorporate Australian archives and materials into the broader international history that I'm interested in. And of course, many of us know the work of Frank Morehouse as a kind of entree into that world of thinking about the international past and Australia's involvement in it. And Edith Campbell Berry, a fictional character that Frank invented in the 1990s, has come to take on a larger-than-life sort of prominence in our memory, I think, of internationalism in the 20th century. And since then, Frank's book came out in the 1990s, and I remember I was working on a history of internationalism at the same time, and in many ways, thinking about real people and the ways in which they engaged the politics of the 20th century, and particularly that first half, was such an inspiration for my own work. Now, since then, a lot more has come out on the history of international institutions. This is fairly new for historians. Political scientists have worked on international institutions for a long time, but historians really didn't until the last few decades or so. And now it really is rather a large sort of field, and it's opening up in new kinds of ways. So that historiography and its debates are the background to this lecture. And what I want to focus on tonight is much more specific. And that is, how can we deepen and refine our understanding of the 20th century international order, both what it is and what it might have been, by looking at and examining these institutions and Australians' engagement with them. My particular interest is in how international institutions, which were so distinctive to the 20th century, and we can discuss whether or not we imagine them as important now, how they were catalysts for international and economic thinking more specifically, and how people that we wouldn't normally imagine as thinkers, let alone economic thinkers, such as businessmen and women, were very important to developing international economic thinking in the 20th century. So to that end, my job tonight is to convince you of a number of things. So the first is that the international history of the 20th century includes Australian international economic thinkers. Secondly, that there is such a thing as international economic thinking, particularly as it was fostered by the existence of international institutions so unique to the 20th century. And I use thinking and not thought precisely because I'm interested in the broader history of economic ideas. The third thing I want to convince you of is that seeing Australians in a history of the economic dimensions of the international order offers us a different view onto both political and economic histories of the 20th century. We see the spectrum of economic ambitions that have defined politics, and we see whose thinking mattered. This same approach, I want to argue, raises questions, further questions, that are worth reflecting on about the significance of international institutions in the shaping of national futures as well. Now, my slides aren't very interesting. They're really just of people. And the people that I'm going to focus on tonight and to illustrate or to pursue these arguments are four Australian international economic thinkers who mattered. And then we can count two as simultaneously statesmen and businessmen, and two are women, and only one is an economist by training. So the first is Stanley Bruce, the man known as the first businessman to become Prime Minister, and of course the first Chancellor of ANU. And in fact, if we go back, you'll see I put in a picture of ANU there. That's our building. And here's Bruce, the League of Nations Council in 1936. We'll find out how he got there. And there's a picture I found of him at ANU. The second international economic thinker is the dried fruit entrepreneur, Frank McDougall. Now, in this story, Frank and Bruce, Stanley Bruce, are a bit of a couple. McDougall is often paired with Bruce in the League history that has been written so far about them, about the period I'm going to look at, although he would emerge as the better remembered and practical internationalist, as the New York Times obituary labelled him. And here, Sean Turnell and Wendy Way's work has been particularly important, I think, in giving Frank the prominence that he deserves in his history. The third person that I want to look at is Eleanor Hinder, an industrial welfare worker come statistician who features more often in histories of women and internationalism. And then finally, the woman who wrote this book, some of you may have read in the past or heard referenced, and who became an important advisor in the US, where she had her career. And that's Persia Campbell, the economist. So I'm going to get stuck in and start with the least likely, in the sense that the protagonists are not economic thinkers in any obvious sense. They introduce us to an interwar world in which businessmen are economic thinkers and in which the international institution is a catalyst expanding their worldview from imperial to international dimensions. So Frank McDougall and Stanley Bruce. The setting for the story is the League of Nations. Established in the course of peacemaking discussions at Versailles after the First World War to meet understandable ambitions for preventing war in the future, and a growing view that not just international political cooperation, but also economic cooperation, the equitable treatment of commerce for all members, and the tackling of any economic circumstance which is likely to lead to international dispute, that these objectives were critical to the ambitions for peace. Now, of course, that failure, the failure to prevent war, has tainted that organisation's history ever after. But much of what interests us now historically is how the League transformed to meet the challenges of an era of accumulating social and economic polycrisis, post-war epidemic, labour unrest, conflict, hunger, unemployment. Stanley Bruce arrived in this setting in the 1930s. Before then, between 1923 and 29, he was the nationalist Australian Prime Minister, espousing men, money and markets and imperial preferences. Melbourne-born Bruce's business credentials came from his family, his father having built a soft goods firm to which he added a Cambridge degree and, like McDougall, military participation in World War I. McDougall was, by contrast, English-born, his grandfather had made a fortune inventing self-raising flour, and his father was the owner of a milling and chemical company. McDougall arrived in Australia in 1909 to take up an 86-acre fruit block in Renmark, South Australia, and began experimenting with dried fruits and drying methods, writing up his results. In the post-war, after he returns from the AIF military campaign, McDougall began his career as an impromptu economic diplomat. He worked for the Australian dried fruits industry on the British Empire Marketing Board and as a government lobbyist for favoured nation status and tariff preferences with Britain, under instruction from Bruce, who was acting as the treasurer for the Australian government. In 1923, McDougall wrote Bruce's speech for the League of Nations World Economic Conference, emphasising the importance of imperial markets. A few years later saw the publication of Sheltered Markets, a study in the value of empire trade. All while the man that Sean Turnell calls the amateur economist, McDougall, was tutoring himself in contemporary economic thought and taking notice of the popular John Maynard Keynes, for example, and the relatively unknown Dutch economist working at the League on business cycles, Jan Tinbergen. From 1927, McDougall was Australia's delegate to the League's economic section, and from 1932 until 1945, the Renmark farmer was economic advisor to the Australian government in London. At this same point, Bruce had arrived in the UK to commence his post-PM career as High Commissioner and Australia's chief delegate to the League of Nations Assembly. In 1933, he took up a seat on the League Council, and within a year he was the rapporteur on financial and economic questions. By 1936, he was president of the Assembly. So in the League's most difficult dying days, in fact, he becomes a really important figure in discussions around how to prevent conflict amongst its members. Now, by contrast, this is also the second half of the 1930s, the period in which Bruce and McDougall really become convinced of the importance of throwing off trade preference and tariffs altogether in favour of a new League of Nations economic agenda, which they would write. Their work together culminated in the 1939 League report that historians still refer to as the Bruce Report, and which is celebrated as the inspiration for the post-war UN Economic and Social Council, a body that becomes an important kind of development from the League's earlier separation of these ideas of economic tasks and social tasks. And he also helps bring about the establishment of the Food and Agricultural Organisation based in Rome. So these are fairly well-known facts about Frank McDougall, actually, and about Bruce, depending on the milieus you hang out in. But it's worth spending a few minutes, I think, reflecting on the report that Bruce produced as the chair of a special committee for the League, partly because of the influence it had and the creation of, the nature of the post-Second World War international institutions, but also because it is one of a series of key economic texts that effectively enlarged the scope of international economic governance in the 20th century. I find it fascinating because of the ideas it supports, this report that Bruce put his name to, and the influential role of these two Australian businessmen, not only in the sense that the special committee that produced it was chaired by Bruce, but that it culminated the arguments that Bruce and McDougall together were making across the League's fora from at least the mid-1930s. So McDougall wasn't on the committee, but he had been the author of an earlier report and was very important in kind of collecting the ideas around which the Bruce report would be written. In the setting of the League, both Bruce and McDougall argued against trade preferences, contrary to their earlier positions, as I've said, and for advancing economic and social goals together. That was their most important sort of emphasis. McDougall conceptualised the importance for focusing those goals on standards of living as a measure of economic policy and nutrition as a measure of standards of living. In 1938, McDougall had drafted a League report on the nutrition approach, as it was known, for a mixed committee of agricultural, economic and health experts, which argued for the League assuming an ever more important role in managing what he called the overproduction of food by rationalising trade and agricultural production. So distinguishing, for example, trade in foods that could best be produced or sourced locally from the great staples whose production was best sourced through trade. Bruce in turn spruiked this report's importance to the League Assembly. He didn't have to work very hard. The study on nutrition was referred to by the New York Times as Book of the Year and praised by the League's economic and finance directors as significant because of the influence it is likely to have on our whole economic outlook. This is Alexander Loveday, an American who was running the economic organization of the League. Ever since the time of Adam Smith, Loveday wrote, economic thought has centered around the art of production or the conditions of citizens as producers. The nutrition movement reflects the first serious endeavor, certainly on an international scale, to consider the economics not of production but of consumption. The economist Heinz Arndt, who would become, of course, important here in the history of economics at ANU, wasn't a complete convert, but he argued that this idea of McDougall's provided a valuable corrective to the confusion of thought which tended to turn shibboleths of finance, economic laws and free trade, balanced budgets or gold standards into the ultimate criteria of economic policy. And instead, this pointed to a saner approach to economic problems. Now, the following year, after the nutrition report came out, the Bruce report appeared, and its actual title was The Development of International Cooperation in Economic and Social Affairs. And this reinforced the idea that a saner approach to economic policy was in fact needed. One of its key lines, I think, was, trade is a means to an end and not an end itself. That end is the wealth and welfare of the people conducting it. Now, to that end, it recommended the creation of a new organism to be known as the Central Committee for Economic and Social Questions, to which should be entrusted the direction and supervision of the work of the League committees dealing with all sorts of questions to do with industry and agriculture, but also public health and hygiene, housing and nutrition, and welfare more generally, and social well-being. So the point was that this particular report brought into focus some of the key themes of the discussions going on around the League, but also McDougall and Bruce's direction. Now, there were debates within the committee about their view of the economy as a realm of political responsibility that extended beyond fiscal policy to social objectives, whether prosperity or nutrition or standard of living were in fact appropriate to the League's work, and whether or not actually this was taking the ambition of the League too far. Now, the work of Sean Turnell in particular has shown that many of these ideas, of course, were part of public discourse in the 1930s. And there is, of course, a more general history that one could write about the importance of the League in that broader discussion. But here I think the important point is the ways in which Bruce and McDougall bring it to bear on the institution itself, and in that way legitimate these objectives, the objective of prosperity, what some of the critics within the committee called the overly optimistic ambitions of comfort and well-being that were written into the report's aims. Now, do we assign credit for these ideas to Bruce or to McDougall? We have some evidence, I think, from the committee meetings that Bruce was concerned that the importance of ambitious ideas be followed and pursued by the institution, and that the details of international economic governance shouldn't perturb them too much. Until we have discussed this primordial question, he argued, we cannot discuss our report. And we have, in fact, here at the National Library in Canberra, McDougall's papers as an invaluable source tracing some of this changing economic thinking and its motivations. They show us a McDougall reflecting on the fact that at a moment when there was a loss of certainty about a future life, interest in conditions affecting this terrestrial life have been intensified. So we could follow this story into the period of the UN and the Charter of the UN that gets written in the post-Second World War. It's Article 55 with its emphasis on higher standards of living, full employment, economic and social progress and development. And of course to the creation of the Food and Agricultural Organization, But I want to leave these businessmen here for now, keeping in mind what they let us see. Firstly, that they are economic thinkers, that the economic imaginaries taking form in this period shift, I think, very clearly from a national imperial to a national, international world economy outlook. And they bring with them, I think, a shifting view of what constitutes the economy, what it is for, and where its fate might be managed. So now let me move to Eleanor Hinder and the difference that a woman might make. And Eleanor brings us to a slightly different topic in international economic thinking, and that is statistics and global equality. Now, Hinder, East Maitland born, same generation in many ways, but a decade younger than Bruce McDougall, but sort of in the same sort of context, really, of intellectual thinking at the time, is often described as a welfare officer or an international public servant. We know that she studied for her Bachelor of Science at Sydney University, graduated in 1914 and began a career, as many young politically engaged women of that time did, as an industrial welfare worker. From the early post-First World War to the Cold War, she also had a lengthy and a diverse career at international institutions. In 1923, she had been attending a conference of industrial welfare workers in France and visited the International Labour Office in Geneva. Now, the ILO, which still exists, of course, was part of the League's institutional system, and was established by the United States largely as a counter to the influence of the Bolshevik Revolution on dissatisfied workers at the time. And it offered a tripartite forum for labour, employers and government. And while it was best known for negotiating labour conditions, Hinder would come to see it as a crucial site for promoting standards of living. In the 1930s, Hinder would have her own chance to leave a mark on this idea through her work in Shanghai. She's a rather extraordinary woman, and a few historians have started to write about her. She's there in the late 1930s in the international settlement in Shanghai, which is divided between Europe's many empires at the time, and stays there into 1942 under Japanese occupation. She's employed during that period by the Shanghai Municipal Council as chief of its industrial and social division. So she's responsible for child protection and for industrial policy. And in both roles, she introduces major reforms. And what I'm particularly interested in is how she conceives of and undertakes the production of local cost of living index figure surveys. She works with locals and oversees the regular compilation, month by month, of figures to show, as she describes, what was happening to the standard of living of the people. Hinder thought of her plan as a way to monitor the rise and fall of the cost of staples, rent, and the shifting currency value. And she had 300 families of all nationalities in the settlements, keeping records of every cent that they spent and received for one whole year. And on that basis, she continued to compile data that became really critical for her position as she managed the influx of Jewish refugees, of which there were 4,000 by January 1939. And in the context of the war and Japanese occupation, she was able to work out the rationing of rice and price control measures. And this, she could track, for example, because of her surveys, the doubling of costs of living between 1936 and 1939, and then the eight times rises by 1941, and the rise by 12 times of the costs of living by the end of that same year, and 26 times by 1942. So using this method, at a time when the standards of living idea is still in its infancy, and statistics are still not really valued in the context of the kind of economic thinking going on at the League of Nations, she's actually developing a really important model that she takes with her into the ILO much later. So we have a situation where, in fact, in the 1920s and 30s, maths and statistics are regarded as ancillary and inferior disciplines. And in fact, we do find that even though there is a League of Nations Statistics Office, that they employ lots of women at 2/3 the salaries of men. But the fact that it's women they employ is a sign that don't take it very seriously. And it is in the era of the UN Economic and Social Affairs Department that statistics begin to be conceived of as international public goods. So by the time that Hinder became part of the production of these international public goods at the UN, she had already engaged in this statistical work on the ground, and she had an experience that had led her to reflect on the need for what she called the economic recalibration of standards of living on a global level. As she put it, can the rest of the world, which has been ready to regiment itself to reduce its standard of living for the winning of the war, continue to sacrifice to provide the wherewithal to finance those developments which will induce the needed rise in standards in other countries? It is in part because I wish to urge this aim that I have left the immediate task for the larger world. So she goes into that larger world, and for her, that larger world, having left behind Shanghai occupied by the Japanese, that larger world is actually opened up to her through the ILO. As she gets there in 1942, as the war rages around her, by this time the ILO has moved from Geneva to Montreal, where it's in exile really, and she has the position of special consultant on Asian questions. And she stays there until 1944, advising on social and economic reform in Asia. Now, the interesting thing I think about this particular moment is that it really defines the themes of her influence on international economic thinking through into the 1960s, when she dies in the early 1960s. And that is her insistence that the ILO be concerned with economic factors' influence on social conditions rather than solely standards of employment. So bringing the economic and social together in the way in which Bruce and McDougall also thought about it. And also imagining the work of international institutions in terms of collaboration. And that is not sending experts to Asia or to China, but collaborating with local experts. In the case of China in those later years of the war and the early post-war, collaborating with Chinese economists rather than bringing people from outside. She brings these same views to her role in the post-war with the British Foreign Office, where she's a delegate to UNRWA technical committees on welfare for the Far East in Shanghai, where she advises on labour matters, as British liaison officer for UN activities in the Far East, and as the only female delegate to the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, and again, as part of the British delegation in this period. Now, from the 1950s, she begins to work in the area of technical assistance. Now, this has a whole other historiography that people are increasingly interested in because of the role of international institutions in development practices, often, with very negative results. She is an enthusiast of industrialization and modernization projects in Asia, but she continues to bring, I think, this particular view of the need to enable local experts and train locals and not impose an external view. And 16 years after her work in Shanghai, she returns to her statistical work, now at the UN, at the Statistical Office, organising and administering a special program to assist governments in Asia in their preparations for and carrying out of censuses of population and agriculture. And again, through the letters of her partner Viola Smith, we find out that in this role, Hinder is still insistent on developing local capacity and not just building statistical bases from outside, and understanding the needs of the particular populations that are the object of these particular UN projects, particularly in Bangkok, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines. So I think just as one final thing to say about Hinder is that we get a sense, I think, too, of how she sees her role in these institutions and more broadly in the autobiography, but it's actually not quite an autobiography that she starts to write, and the manuscript for that is in the State Library of New South Wales, and in that she constructs an autobiography that is the story of 5 women in Asia. She can't tell the story as just about herself. She constructs it as a story of 5 women, including Viola Smith, her partner, who was US Trade Commissioner in Shanghai at the time that Hinder was there as well. So if we reflect on Hinder's international economic thinking then, she fits with Bruce and McDougall in the sense that while we wouldn't normally discuss them in a history of economic thought, it is easy to see that they did impinge on and influence economic thinking. Specifically, they shifted the focus of economic discussion in the institutions in which they worked, to varying degrees and in diverse settings, but in all 3 cases, international institutions were the catalysts, I'd argue, for the international dimensions of their thinking, even if the implications were as much local, national, subnational. And Hinder's participation was more practically oriented. Did it owe anything to economic thought more generally? This is something I'd like to kind of probe a bit more, but I am interested that, in the fact that in 1963, in her correspondence, not long before her death, we find her sort of mulling over a description of her written nearly 20 years earlier by a man called Randall Gould, who had written about Hinder's work in a book on post-war China. Now, in that book, China in the Sun, published 1946, he describes her as shaping a unique and vital administrative social instrument in China's greatest industrial centre, always having the welfare of the workers in her great heart. But, he says, she accepted the capitalistic scheme of things and achieved most of her many successes by, in fact, persuasion exerted on the employers, mostly though not all Chinese. And he calls her an enlightened capitalist. I don't know enough about Randall Gould. Someone else might know more about him. But Hinder has obviously been mulling this for a while because 2 decades later she writes to him and says, you know, I've always moved from where I was. I did not always, and indeed often did not, go along with the thinking around about me, but I used the instruments at hand, evolutionary, not revolutionary. Most of us did. Of course, just where capitalism sits in this 20th century international economic thinking is the question that historians are now asking, posing the problem, what did international economic thinkers think that their economic thinking was evolving towards? Now, I hope I've convinced you that at the least, it's worth reflecting on international economic thinking as a thing. And I want to turn to my emphasis in this lecture on the Australian dimensions of that thinking. Even if we agree that each of these international economic thinkers might be in their distinct ways in Australian, I want to ask, is it useful to think of them as Australians? And this is a question that the La Trobe scholar Eve Rees has taken up in a recent Australian historical studies article on Persia Campbell, my final international economic thinker. So Campbell's contribution to economics is best known in terms of her consumer theories and even consumer rights advocacy. And my interest in Campbell is precisely in the ways in which she connects with the thinking of McDougall and Hinder, and how she helps us reflect on how we understand the relationship of the national and the international as sites and subjects of economic thinking in the 20th century. She was born in Narragunda, like Hinder to teachers, and Persia Campbell took her BA at Sydney. She went on to discover consumer economics abroad at the same time as McDougall was informing himself about theories of underconsumption. In 1940, Campbell's Columbia University PhD became the book Consumer Representation in the New Deal. And Rees describes this as a welfarist manifesto that bore a remarkable resemblance to the League of Nations' contemporaneous welfare ethic. At the same time as McDougall placed the standard of living in the forefront of world economic problems, Campbell insisted that US government policy be directed, as Rees writes, towards the goal of a better living standard for all, not only the people of this nation, but for all people. So both McDougall and Campbell separately agreed that living standards were best raised by making the voice of the consumer more effective. In a 1927 speech to the League of Nations Union in Sydney, Campbell bemoaned the low standard of living in Asiatic countries, and she insisted that standards of living in the Pacific countries should be raised and not lowered to one level. So this is really the theme of Hinder as well in her work at the ILO. And in fact, we find it more commonly in those circles of thinking amongst feminists in the 1930s and after. And Hinder met Campbell, we know. In the letters, there's a reference to the brilliant economist from Sydney University and how she wants to see her again. During World War II and after, Campbell's life was in the US, though. In the post-war, Campbell became Professor of Economics at Queen's College in New York, and she was chairman of the American National Conference on the Food and Agriculture Organization, McDougall's particular body, and advisor to the US Interagency Committee on the FAO. Later, she became a delegate to the FAO annual conference. She was one of the leaders of FAO work in the United States. She was emphasizing raised levels of living a lot, as well as trying to emphasize the importance of consumption as a way of thinking about economies rather than production. And of course, putting the emphasis on equitable distribution of incomes as well as an important theme. She emphasised, like McDougall and Bruce and Hinder, that economic development must be linked to social programs. She didn't work at international organisations, but after retiring from academia, she became very active in UN circles. On one view, she almost lived at the United Nations. From her position as a female in a kind of twilight zone of lobbyists, Campbell churned out summaries of UN proceedings and reports. She penned official submissions to the UN Economic and Social Council and made interjections at UN meetings. And Rees argues that it's particularly her editorial work at the International Development Review that sees her mobilise her economic credentials to challenge the growthmanship of economic development from within, making her a key intermediary between the lead broker of development policy and those working on the ground. So in all this history, for Rees, it's Campbell's Australian background that matters. It was there, they argue, under the influence of Australian progressivism that she came to understand economics as a discipline concerned with social welfare and to view economists as political actors who could and should intervene in the wider world. Now, we all know that that the Australian landscape as such exerted other kinds of influence on international organisations in the 1920s and 30s. When the League was being invented in 1919, it was an Australian statesman who managed to keep race equality out of its charter, and an Australian government that exploited the League's conception of trusteeship and its granting of New Guinea by deploying forced labour and appropriating Nauru's phosphate industry. Susan Peterson has noted that although the exploitation of extraterritorial labour and land were contrary to both the League's mandate trusteeship principles and its open door policy, these practices survived regardless. Nauru was far away, writes Peterson. No one on the League's mandate commission knew anything about it, and Australia carefully suppressed any record of Nauruans' discontent. As historians increasingly are showing up, the League of Nations was not simply the catalyst for new ways of bringing the social and economic together. The ANU economist Heinz Arndt noted that in 1939, the League's Economic and Finance Organisation recommended considerations on what methods of collaboration appear to them most likely to promote international trade on as liberal a basis as possible, since there has never been a time in history in which it was more important that all countries should do everything in their power to promote international trade on the most liberal basis possible, and in such a way as to allow all states to benefit by the commercial agreement. So this is coming out of the League. So there's no other kind of end or imperative rather than that. So with a turn of the historical kaleidoscope, the pieces can fall into a finite number of national international patterns. Arndt's own career, interestingly, represents the integral ways in which national and international paths were connected sites of thinking and doing. And there's a wonderful, I think it's an ANU Press published biography of Arndt that shows him going to Geneva and coming back with all sorts of ideas about economic planning and saying, this is what Australia needs. His experience showed him that economic planning is not just something that communist countries do. In fact, France had a 5-year plan. What could Australia have? Another turn of the kaleidoscope produces one pattern into which the four individuals I've discussed tonight can fall. The pattern with its trenchant message, as summed up in the Bruce report, trade is a means to an end and not an end in itself. That end is the wealth and welfare of the people conducting it. And this pattern, I think, is described best by historians Patricia Clavin and Sunil Amrith as the dramatic re-articulation of economic thinking that turned around the nutrition approach of the 1930s, rewriting the relationship between social and economic and political rights on a national and international, as well as imperial scale. So this was the spectrum of international economic thinking institutionalized in the post-war and lost to the Cold War, this pattern that Hinder, McDougall, Bruce and Campbell bring into view. But even in that setting of the 1930s, as new historical work ready to turn the kaleidoscope will continue to show, more women and businessmen engaged the challenges of international economic thinking. And then in the Cold War period as well, there's still a lot, I think, to discover about the ways in which businessmen in particular imagined themselves as the enablers of a more equal world in a public domain that historians and political scientists alike for too long have thought about, I think, as abstracted, homogenous and homogenizing and distant institutional spaces. Thank you.